So we're going to look at processing this image and looking at some of the specific tools in Adobe Camera Raw. So once again, I've opened up my RAW file, and this file is not a JPEG, it's not a Photoshop file, it's not a TIFF, but it's the actual RAW file that we will convert into a Photoshop file once we make the adjustments to this photograph. But before we do that, let's go back and review the gray card and how to neutralize color in an image. So here's my image with the gray card. I'm going to go up into my white balance tool, click on my gray card, and then holding the command key down, click on that image and take that gray card correction and sync that gray card image to this image, and I'm going to hit OK. And that's the color adjustment on this particular photograph. Now, before we do anything with this photograph, we need to understand how Photoshop files work and how Photoshop works. So once again, every single photograph that you take is made up of red, green, and blue values. But also within that range of red, green, and blue, we have a range of highlights and shadows, ranging from black to white, and grays in between those black and white points. Now in Photoshop, an absolute black is 0, meaning if you had an image that gave a reading of 0, it would be absolute black without detail. Inversely, a highlight is 255, and 255 being absolute white without detail. So if you had an image with parts in it that had white values of 255, those areas would be without any tonality, and it would be pure white. Well, what does this mean with respect to a photograph? Well, it's critically important when we're taking portraits that we retain detail in the skin tones. And so how do we do that? Well, Photoshop has this great little tool right up here, and it is called a color sampler tool. And I'm going to select on that tool right now. And I'm going to bring it over to the portrait, and I'm going to click on the portrait here, and you'll notice that it creates this little mark with a 1 on it. I'm going to come down here, make another point for 2, and another one for 3. Now if you look up here, as soon as I made that first point with the number 1, it created these reference targets for me here, number 1, number 2, and number 3. And if you look at those values, those are the absolute values of red, green, and blue, and also showing how dark or how light the image is under that specific area. And this is very, very handy when we need to determine the reproduction of tonality in the photograph itself. And this can relate back to the histogram and also back to the highlight warning function in the camera that we can have activated while we're taking pictures. I'm going to come over to the histogram, and the histogram and all of these tools can be viewed when you're selecting this tab, which is called Basic. So these are some of the basic functions for processing your RAW file. So with the histogram, you'll notice that on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, I have these two little pyramid-shaped things. And as I hover my mouse over it, it says shadow clipping warning and highlight clipping warning. And what these do is I can turn these on to indicate when my shadows are getting really dark and when my highlights are getting really bright, i.e. Adobe Camera Raw will tell me when my highlights are approaching values that will not reproduce any detail, and when my shadows are approaching values that are not reproducing any detail. So I'm going to turn these on by just clicking on them, and you can tell they're on because they have a little white square around them. Up here, I can also find information when I actually took the picture, telling me that I used an aperture of f5 at a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, ISO 800. It also tells me that I'm working with a color photograph right now, and if I wanted to convert this to black and white, I could hit this button. And the profile it's telling me that I'm working in Adobe Color.